Shabbat Shalom. We are very excited to welcome this week into Congregation Shaar Tzedek, Professor Stephen Berk. Dr. Berk is the Henry and Sally Schaefer Professor of Holocaust and Jewish Studies at Union College in Schenectady, New York. He's a former chair of the Department of History, director of the program in Russia and East European Studies, and helps advise the Hillel organization at Union. Professor Berk is an absolutely superb lecturer and teacher. He is much sought after as a guest speaker, always informative, interesting, and entertaining. Professor Berk is widely known for his expertise on the Holocaust, Russia, the Middle East, and a variety of Jewish subjects. We had such a wonderful evening last night learning from Professor Berk, and we look forward to continuing to learn from him this morning and again after Shabbat lunch, where he'll speak once again. And we continue to be grateful to Beverly Baker and to the Morris and Beverly Baker Foundation in memory of Morris D. Baker for sponsoring this wonderful learning opportunity, this Shabbat of learning. So without further ado, we are so thrilled to welcome our outstanding scholar in residence, Professor Stephen Berk.
Thank you. Just make sure you have it turned on. Right, turn it on. Shabbat Shalom and Mazal Tov to the Jennings family. In the middle of the 19th century, not the 20th century, but in the middle of the 19th century, the major issue confronting European diplomacy was the issue of Schleswig and Holstein, the southern provinces of Denmark, which were inhabited by people who spoke German. Should Denmark have those provinces? Should Prussia have those provinces? Or should the Habsburg Empire have those provinces? A very complex issue. The only man that knew about it was the man that knew everything. That was Lord Palmerston, British Prime Minister, British Foreign Minister. A group of reporters gathered around Palmerston in London one day, and they asked him, Lord Palmerston, who has the right claim? What's the truth about Schleswig and Holstein? And Palmerston replied, there are only three men in the world that know about Schleswig-Holstein, that know the truth. One is the King of Prussia, died last year. The other is a German philosopher. He's in a mental institution. I'm the third, and I forgot what it's all about. I mention this to you because alongside of the Middle East, Schleswig-Holstein looks very lucid indeed. The Middle East is a political zoo. It is very, very difficult to deal with, very difficult to understand. Let me move from west to east. I begin with Turkey, the heir to the Ottoman Empire. Turkey was once the poster child of people in the New York Times and of a number of academicians. It was supposed to prove, let us say, that there was no inconsistency, that Islam and democracy, Islam and economic development could operate. That was true for some time. But as anyone who is reading the newspapers today, or watching the news on television, listening on the radio, that person would know that President Erdogan has moved, let us say, really to the Islamist right. He has turned out to be a dictator, crushing the army, crushing the police, really manipulating the press, and of course, those good old days when we used to say that the only Muslim country that El Al could fly to was, of course, Turkey and Istanbul. Today, El Al continues to fly there, but Turkey has become a bastion of anti-Israeli sentiment within the Middle East, and of course, President Erdogan has not been reluctant to play the anti-Semitic card, blaming all sorts of problems in Turkey, not only upon Israel, but upon Jewish financiers and the international Jewish community. If we move a little bit to the east, we move to Egypt. President al-Sisi rules, and he rules fairly well. But the fact of the matter is he's one bullet away from oblivion. For one of the basic facts of life in Egypt, we may not like it. We may not like it. But in the only democratic election that was ever held in Egypt, it is the Muslim Brotherhood that won. And if you add to those supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, those who support the Salafis, an even more traditional and right-wing group, this is an organization that probably commands the allegiance of probably well over 50 to 60% of the Egyptian population. President al-Sisi has been good for Israel. President al-Sisi closed 170 tunnels that went into Hamas and into the Gaza Strip. But once again, how long he can hold on, ruling over a population that is vociferously and very vehemently opposed to him, I do not know. A little bit further to the east, we come to the Gaza Strip. There, Hamas is in rule. And Hamas, there should be no ambiguity about what Hamas stands for. A reporter from the New York Times met the leader of Hamas, the founder of Hamas, Sheikh Yassin, just before he died, just before he was killed by the Israelis. And the reporter asked the Sheikh, if the Israelis withdrew from every settlement, from every possible settlement in Gaza and on the West Bank, would you make peace with Israel? And the reporter was astonished to hear from the Sheikh and his closest associates. They looked at the reporter, and it was very clear to the reporter. It didn't make any difference. The Israelis could withdraw from every settlement. It was the existence of Israel itself that was a problem. One doesn't have to be a geographical wizard to figure out what Hamas is saying. When Hamas says, we want a Palestinian state, the boundaries of which will be the river and the sea. The river is the Jordan, the sea is the Mediterranean. There is no place for the existence of Israel. Moreover, Hamas and another associated organization known as Islamic Jihad spew forth the worst anti-Semitism that one can imagine. I teach the Holocaust. I am a student of the Holocaust. And I can tell you that there is nothing, I'll put it another way, virtually everything or almost everything that Adolf Hitler said between 1933 and 1939 is being said by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. I am a professor of history. Some of you may have taken history courses. You may not have liked them. You may remember very little, but certainly you'll be astonished by this. Who would have believed that according to Hamas, the Jews are responsible, not the Zionists, the Jews are responsible for the French Revolution of 1789, the revolutions of 1848. The Jews brought about the First World War and the Second World War, and the Jews brought the communists to power. That is, to use the old language, that's Narishkeit. That's foolishness. It is stupidity, and it is very, very dangerous. To the north, of course, is Lebanon. Lebanon is a confessional state. That is a state in which the allegiance is not to the country on the part of large numbers of people, but to the religious confession. In Lebanon, the dominant militia, the only militia that is legally allowed to own arms, is of course Hezbollah, literally the party of God. No ambiguity about Hezbollah, no ambiguity or ambivalence concerning Sheikh Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. The Sheikh is reputed to have said, it is a pity that all the Jews of the world have not gathered in Israel, because then they could be all eliminated with one blow. In short, Hezbollah is as fervent in its anti-religious sentiment as is Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Syria is the ultimate political, let us say, dysfunctional state. To show you how confusing all of this is, again, there is Bashar Assad, the man like his father who governed Syria with an iron hand. There is opposition to him, but the problem for the United States, we of course want really Assad to disappear from the face of the earth, or at the very least disappear from power. The foremost fighting organization within Syria, and the one that is most loyal to the United States, the one that is armed and funded by the United States, the one that has fought very well, are the Syrian Kurds. Yet it is the Syrian Kurds who are being bombed, among others, being bombed by Turkey, our alleged ally in Syria and throughout the Middle East. It is a very, very confusing situation in Syria. We do not know where it is going to end. Here I quote you. I was a professor of history. I should quote distinguished historians, but let me put it to you this way. I quote Yogi Berra. What's the famous remark? It's not over until it's over. And I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows, where it's going to be and when it is going to be over in Syria. This is a very, very dangerous situation. It is a no-win situation. If Assad stays in power, Mr. Putin stays in Syria, Hezbollah stays in Syria, Iran stays in Syria, it's got to be a nightmare for the state of Israel. If Assad is removed, Who's going to guarantee the extremist Islamic organizations like Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, and a whole host of others will not use Syria as a launching pad for the attack upon Israel? And then I move, of course, the furthest to the east, and that is Iran. I am old enough to remember. I was a child, a very young child at the time, and there are people who are sitting here before me who are as old as I am, or if not older. Do you realize, for those of you who are old enough to remember, this is the second time in our lifetime, that a dominant politician, the leader of a state, has proclaimed a desire to exterminate the Jewish people from the face of the earth. Given the fact that the first man, Adolf Hitler, almost did it, the fact of the matter, of course, is for us is now that the Ayatollah Khomeini, when he talks about the elimination of Israel from the face of the earth, when he talks about Israel as being a malignancy, a cancerous growth in the Middle East that has to be removed, that Israel will not survive another 10 to 20 years, that means that's a call for extermination. And we would be damn fools for the second time in our lifetime to hear this and to not think that there is a possibility that he will try to do it. And when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians, one has to be very careful here. The thing that we certainly have learned is that for all of those academicians and government people who used to say, solve the Arab-Israeli dispute and you will bring peace to the Middle East. No one in his right mind or her right mind should believe that anymore. If Israel and the Palestinians made peace tomorrow, the war in Syria would go on. The tension between President al-Sisi and his population, that would continue. And again, as we all know, perhaps the most significant tension, the most significant conflict within the Middle East is the Sunni-Shiite conflict. If Israel, God forbid, were to disappear tomorrow, all of these conflicts would continue. And when we now shift over and talk about the Arab-Israeli dispute, a number of things have to be said. I will say it right at the outset. I am a two-state man. I believe it is imperative that there be created a Palestinian state that will live in peace and security alongside of an Israeli state. I believe Yitzhak Rabin, whose death we of course remember, it's almost 20 years ago, it is 20 years ago, Rabin had it right. What our parents told us as children, what our teachers should have told us, and many of them did, they're absolutely right. You cannot have your cake and eat it. The Israeli dilemma, of course, is. The dilemma in the Middle East is. How do you really reconcile the need of Israeli security and, of course, the legitimate need of the Palestinians to have their own state? Make no mistake. The Palestinians find themselves humiliated, and in some ways, they are humiliated. But, again, the dilemma for Israel is this. If Israel holds on to the West Bank and gives citizenship to the Palestinians, Israel remains a democratic state, but not a Jewish state. Yasser Arafat used to say correctly, we have a weapon that is more powerful than Israeli bombs, nuclear weapons. And those weapons, the weapons that we have, are the wombs of Palestinian women. But if Israel gives up the West, let's say, holds on to the West Bank and does not give citizenship to the Palestinians, Israel remains a Jewish state, but not a democratic state. That's the dilemma. On the one hand, you need to balance Israeli security with legitimate aims of the Palestinians. On the other, the Israelis have to decide whether they want to hold on or not to hold on. Lest you think I'm tilting somewhat to the left, the fact of the matter is that there's a problem for Israelis. 35 years ago, I spoke in a synagogue in Miami, and I said there had to be a two-state solution, and that Israel would have to recognize a Palestinian capital within at least part of Jerusalem. A man got up, it was a beautiful synagogue, I must tell you, and I'm not pandering here, not as beautiful as this. A man got up and called me a disgrace to the Jewish people, a traitor to the state of Israel. Well, the fact of the matter is, most Israelis would have agreed at that time. But today, the overwhelming population of the state of Israel does go along, acquiesce in the idea of an independent Palestinian state living in peace and security alongside the state of Israel. Everybody knows that's B. A is the status quo. The question is, how do you move from A to B? And the problem is, how do you deal with a Palestinian population that gives its support, or a good deal of its support, to organizations that want to destroy the state of Israel. Again, so I am trying to be as unequivocal and as clear as I can be. I believe in a two-state solution. I believe most Israelis believe in a two-state solution. But how do you convince large numbers of Palestinians to abandon the idea of, again, all of the refugees returning home, which will destroy the state of Israel? And how do you get them, large numbers of them, to abandon the idea that the necessity is imperative, in fact, to destroy the state of Israel? This is the issue of the time. Again, to give you an example, Prime Minister Olmert, whatever you may think about him, Prime Minister Olmert made Mahmoud Abbas an offer that no one should ever refuse. That was to share Jerusalem, have some of the refugees return, give the Palestinians control over the Temple Mount. And Olmert, who spoke at my college, Olmert said, I waited and waited and waited. I waited for an answer from Abbas. He came to my house. We spoke about the maps. We drew the lines on the maps. He seemed to shake his head, understanding me and approving me, but I needed a formal response from him. He went back to Ramallah, and I never got the response. Even those who tilt in the direction of the Palestinians have had to really agree that Abbas has not been forthcoming. Even Netanyahu, and you can criticize Netanyahu from one day to the next day. You can do it up one wall and down the other wall. Netanyahu has offered to meet with Abbas for months, and Abbas has refused to meet with him. Now, what has to be done? I'm a Russian historian by training. I ask the old Russian question, что делать? What has to be done? Well, I'm not sure. My students accuse me of a multitude of sins. Waffling, I can assure you, is never, never one of them. I would suggest that it is time for President Obama, Prime Minister Cameron, Angela Merkel, Hollande of France, that they should make a trip to the Middle East. Maybe they should go together, maybe they go separately. They should make a visit first to Jerusalem and speak to Prime Minister Netanyahu. They should tell him that the extension of settlements in the eastern part of Jerusalem and beyond the Green Line, he doesn't have to withdraw them, but he should not build new settlements. Now, mind you, I'm telling you again, if Israel withdrew from every settlement on the West Bank, it would not bring peace. But at the very least, if Prime Minister Netanyahu refrained from making new settlements, it would enhance the image of Israel in the United States and throughout the world. It is not a panacea, but it's probably the right thing to do. And then these same leaders of countries should make the trek to Ramallah, and they should say publicly to Abbas and the Palestinians, now, they don't have to use it in the language that I'm saying it. They should have more nuance. But what they should really be saying to the Palestinians is, you're not going home. Forget it. We will give you billions upon billions of dollars to create a sovereign and prosperous and independent state of Palestine. But you've got to seize the terrorist activity. And you've got to stop talking about all of the refugees or even most of the refugees returning home. That will give cover. If they go to Netanyahu in Jerusalem and speak to the Israelis, Netanyahu can say to the Israeli public, listen, I'm the son of the Father. I'm a follower of Jabotinsky. I know we have the right to settle on this land, but the Americans and the Europeans will not allow it, and therefore we have to stop it. And when he goes to Ramallah, he can say to Abbas, and Abbas then say to his people, listen, I'm from Sfat. I want to go home too. We all want to go home. But the Americans and the Europeans will not allow it. Let's get on with the business. Let's get on with the business of creating a sovereign, independent, and prosperous state for the Palestinian people. Will it bring peace? I don't know. I must tell you, I say this parenthetically, but I must tell you, nobody listens to me. Nobody. My wife doesn't listen to me. My children don't listen to me. My grandchildren don't listen to me. The only people who listen to me are my students. And the only reason that they listen to me is not because I'm giving them the emes, the truth, but because I give them their grades and because I write their recommendations for law school, medical school, and business school. They're the only ones that listen to me. Whether this will happen, I do not know. There's a lot of pessimism out there. There really is. I must say, I find it in my own family. People say, there will never be peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and some real Verbrennte pessimists say, Israel is doomed, that time is running out. I don't believe that. I believe that the past is prologue here. I believe that Israel has survived innumerable crises. 48, 56, 67, 73, 82, wherever you go. And Israel will survive the current terrorist attacks upon it in the present. Do you understand how remarkable that first and only Jewish state is, the first and only one in 2,000 years? You can talk again until you're blue in the face. We are not Vestal virgins anymore. We know that Israel has blemishes. We know that there are internal problems, but never miss the forest for the trees. Achievement after achievement. It is the end. It is the ultimate place of refuge for our people. Every Jewish man, woman, and child, 1 million Soviet Jews, 200,000 Moroccan Jews, 200,000 Romanian Jews, 60,000 Ethiopian Jews. Every Jewish man, woman, and child who wants to go to the state of Israel can do so. Achievement number 2, it is Silicon Valley East. It really is. I hope your cell phones are turned off, but the cell phones, of course, the cell phone technology comes really from Israel. If you have a computer with a Pentium chip, it comes from Israel. If you go to a supermarket and they scan what you have bought, that technology too comes from Israel. Not bad for a country of 8 million people without any natural resources. And maybe because I'm a Holocaust historian, and I take people to various parts of the world, and we go to the old Warsaw Ghetto. I go to a place, again, very few people know about him, the Shmuel Ziegelbaum, a good Jewish man, a leader of the Workers' Jewish Bund in Warsaw. The Polish underground smuggles him out in late 41, actually in late 1940. They smuggle him out. He comes to London to plead the cause of Jews and Poles in German-occupied Poland, and no one listens to him. He hears that his wife and children have gone up the chimney at Treblinka. And what does he do? He does a terrible thing. He kills himself. And then he says, not then, but after, but just before he died, he writes an open letter to the world. Perhaps by this terrible act, that is his own suicide, I can somehow alert the world and save the last Jews of Poland. The last Jews of Poland are not going to be saved. They are not going to be saved. They're going to go up the chimney, to use that colloquial expression of some Holocaust survivors. That's what Jewish powerlessness is all about. But then you go forward 33 years, July 4th, 1976. Israeli planes land with Israeli soldiers at the Entebbe airport and rescue Jewish captives. And 13 years later, Israeli planes land not with soldiers, but with doctors and social workers and nurses. They land at an airport in Addis Ababa and extricate 13,000 Ethiopian Jews. That's what a Jewish state means. We are not powerless anymore. There is now a state that defends the interests and the aspirations of the Jewish people. It took a long time. With all of its flaws, there's now a sovereign state that really has sovereignty. And finally, of course, some people don't recognize it. The fact of the matter is, the country lives in a perpetual state of siege. It has fought war after war after war. And yet, when all is said and done, Israel is still closer to Athens than it is to Sparta. It is the only democratic state in the Middle East and one of the world's great democracies. Not bad for a country living in a perpetual state of siege, again, with just a shade over 8 million people. So, the past is prologue. Israel will in fact survive, and it will thrive. And then for those who are so pessimistic, again, the historian is not smarter. He is not, or she is not smarter than the political scientist, the anthropologist, or the sociologist. But the historian brings to the table a sense of perspective. That's why we're historians. And for those who say never, let me tell you what you and I, at least those of a certain age, what you and I have lived through. Let me give you an example. If you took a good course in World War II, or you remember the early days of the war, one of the most famous photographs of the Second World War was taken in 1940. It's a picture of a middle-aged Frenchman, tears streaming down his face as German soldiers goose-stepped down the Champs-Élysées. This was the nadir of the French experience. Who would have dreamed that less than 40 years later, a combined German and French unit would march arm in arm down the same Champs-Élysées? Who would have dreamt that in 2015, the anchor of the European Union is the alliance between France and Germany? And then in 1975, Time magazine sent a reporter to South Africa. And the reporter asked a group of Afrikaners, "What will you do if the blacks rise?" And the Afrikaners replied, "We will ride till our stirrups are filled with blood. We will never give in to them." 15 years later, that great and decent man, Nelson Mandela, comes out of prison, and apartheid disappears into the garbage can of history. And again, I must tell you, I am a Soviet specialist by training. No one, including myself, predicted what was going to happen. We all knew that the situation of the Soviet Union for the party was bad. If you spent 4 hours in Moscow in the 1970s or in the 1980s, and you saw 500 people line up for toilet paper, you knew there was something wrong in Soviet society, that Marxism-Leninism had lost its legitimacy. But we all, without a single exception, all Soviet specialists all over the world believed that by sheer intimidation, by the party, by the Red Army, by the KGB, the Soviet Union would last well into the 21st century. March 1985, Gorbachev comes to power. All of a sudden we hear about glasnost, openness, perestroika restructuring, novaya myšlenie, new thinking in Soviet foreign policy, and the communist system really disappears once again into that trash bin of history. The lesson here, if you're inclined to be so pessimistic, and you say that there will never be peace between the Israelis and the Arabs, let me tell you what the ultimate lesson of history is. You never, never, never say never. Shabbat Shalom.